Travel in those Civil War days is not a venture to be taken lightly. Fares on sailing ships are lower than on the new steamships, which have recently come into service, but the sail vessels take 2 or 3 times longer to make the crossing, and conditions are typically much poorer, and in some reported cases are horrible. So far, we have not been able to learn in what ships John and Richard made their respective Atlantic crossings from Liverpool to New York. We do know that both made the voyage with their wives and young children, although on different ships and in different years. We have no idea if they brought their tools of trade with them. Land travel is by railroad, as that new mode of travel is being extended in all directions in both England and America. Here I speculate. John from Columbus writes a letter to his older brother, maybe more than one, about how great things are in Ohio. There are schools for the kids. He has rented a better house than he had in England. And there is a great demand for files here in the States, rapidly developing into an industrial powerhouse. Why don't you come here? There's lots of room and opportunity in Ohio. His letters are persuasive. In 1862, Richard Alfred Horner is 34 years old, and his wife Harriet seems willing to join her sister Mary, who is in Ohio with her husband John. And that scenario, folks, is what answers the question I pondered for many years. The question, what would possess a 34-year-old man with a wife and 4-year-old son, pack up, leave the land of generations of the family, with a pretty secure job, and move to the U.S. in the middle of our great Civil War? Lots of unknowns, lots of risks. Well, Brother John did the same thing 2 years ago. It's working out fine for him. And so Richard, Harriet, and Alfred are good to go. And they apparently go straight to Columbus, a place where John and family are settled in. John has probably lined up a job for his brother. There seems to be a bond between the brothers that endures for many years. The question is answered. In this year of 1862, horrendous battles are taking place not so far from Ohio, at Bull Run and Antietam, where 4,000 Americans die in a single day. Britain is officially neutral, but secretly building warships for the South. The following year, the epic battles of Gettysburg in neighboring Pennsylvania kill multitudes of both blue and gray soldiers. 2 years later, in 1864, the Columbus City Directory has 2 consecutive alphabetical entries. The first, John F. Horner, the other, Richard Alfred Horner. Both list their occupations as file cutters. Looks like they have found their niche. Sometime in the next few years, it appears, all of the immigrants from Yorkshire become naturalized United States citizens, although I have never found a formal record to prove that. Honest Abe is near to bringing an end to the war between the states. Meanwhile, other significant events are taking place on the western shore of Lake Michigan, several hundred miles to the west and north. Back in 1840 or so, an upstate New York farmer by the name of Jerome Increase Case had learned of the new grain reaper invented by Cyrus McCormick out in Illinois. He has also learned that the southeastern portion of the territory of Wisconsin has become an important wheat-producing area. Case has purchased a primitive type of threshing machine and is in the business of going from farm to farm doing custom harvesting. His crude machine, which he is continuously tinkering to improve, does the work of a dozen men. He sees a better future in Wisconsin than his home state. He moves to Rochester in western Racine County, Wisconsin. Before leaving New York, he has purchased 5 of the primitive machines. On the rail trip to Rochester, he sells 4 of the threshers at a good profit. With the remaining machine, he goes into the custom harvesting business in Wisconsin. As a side note, this farm boy cannot avoid making the observation that very little wheat has been grown in southeast Wisconsin since he can remember. In fact, I never knew the area was once considered a major wheat area. Of course, it is small potatoes compared to the enormous areas to the west on the prairies that will soon after the Homestead Act of 1862 be opened to settlement. Those lands will provide the huge future markets for Jerome Case. As he exploits them, Racine will boom. Case is a tinkerer and inventor. He thinks what would really be useful is a complete threshing machine. He has an idea for a better one than the ones currently available. In his shop, which may have been in his kitchen for all we know, in his shop he builds prototypes which he uses in his business, but discovers there is a good market for his machines. His timing is good. The Homestead Act of Congress adopted in 1862, and those lands to be developed lie just to the west of Wisconsin. Soon he needs bigger and better facilities. He wants to develop another raceway to provide power at the dam on the Fox River in the village of Rochester. But the owner of the dam refuses his request. And at this point, I'll put in another side note. That dam is to be a thorn in the side of the Horners for many years. It is the biggest problem for the drainage of the Wind Lake farm. Backed up water caused by that structure causes thousands and thousands of dollars of lost crops over the years for the Horners and the other growers on the Wind Lake Marsh. At any rate, with a denial of his use of water power, Case decides to move 20 miles east to Racine. At the mouth of the Root River, with a good port, nearby farmland, and much closer to the land being settled under the Homestead Act, Racine becomes home for Case. He begins what is to become the J.I. Case Company. That company will be an innovator in threshing machines and agriculturally adapted steam engines. His machines are very successful. The booming manufacturing business is generating lots of demand for labor and tools, including files. Word, and I'm speculating here, reaches Columbus, Ohio. Sometime between 1865 and 1870, the Horner brothers relocate from Ohio to Racine. But April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Saturday, 2 weeks later, April 29th, the funeral train carrying his body from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, makes a stop in Columbus. 37-year-old Richard, 6-month pregnant Harriet, and 7-year-old Alfred join the huge throngs that crowd into the rotunda of the Ohio Capitol building to view the fallen president. Nearly 75 years later, Alfred will share this memory with his schoolgirl granddaughter, Shirley Fritz. Andrew Johnson succeeds the assassinated Lincoln as President of the United States. 3 months after the sad viewing, Richard and Harriet's sixth child, Willis, is born in Columbus, July 11, 1865, 7 years after the birth of Alfred. Like 4 of their first 5 children, this one did not flourish and dies 3 months later, October 21st. It was then they purchased the cemetery plots in Columbus, Ohio, that were the reason my father went there in the late 1950s. The child-rearing record of Harriet and Richard is not good. Of the first 6 births, only Alfred survives as 1866 dawns. Modern parents will have trouble comprehending child mortality of that magnitude. And the last record we have of Richard in Columbus is the city directory of 1867. Both the Richard and John Horner families show up in Racine in the census of 1870. Ulysses S. Grant is president. For a long time, we could not find the record of Richard anywhere in that year. Finally, Don Hoff at his computer in California finds a Richt Horner in Racine in 1870. But the last name is wrong. Other facts are skewed. Details, though, fit our man in other ways, and I speculate in my email response to Don. The discrepancies come about like this, I think. First, you have an English accent, and maybe a not very bright census taker. The subjects never see what the taker writes, so they don't correct it. "What's your name?" "Horner," Richard replies in his Cockney twang. "What's your age?" "I was born in 28, wifey here in 33, the lad in 58. The taker does the math in his head and screws it up. And I also think I remember Al sometimes referred to as Richard. Or how about Richard telling the census guy, "Yeah, Junior there was born in 58. The census taker has dropped the first letter off the surname, miscalculated ages by 3 or 4 years, recorded 12-year-old Alfred as Richard. But he records the man of the house as a file manufacturer. John's family, in a different ward in the city with a different census taker, is recorded correctly, and John as the familiar file cutter. I have no doubt Richt Horner is my great-great-grandfather, Richard Horner. I think Don Hoff out in the Golden State, who has the same relationship to him, agrees. During the 1870s, there are a host of events. In March of 1871, the 7th child is born to Richard and Harriet. It is a son they name Francis, but most of our future references will note him as Frank. Francis, also known as Frank, survives for 87 years, but not without his own personal misfortune. In August of 1874, the 8th and last child is born to Richard and Harriet. They name her Harriet after her mother, but she is ever after referred to as Hattie. Through the years, most of the census takers hear incorrectly and record her as Hallie. At her birth, Richard and Harriet are 46 and 42 years old, a little long in the tooth for parents. But here we encounter a mystery. Subsequent censuses here ever after report that Francis and Hattie were born in Ohio. We have just learned that Richard and Harriet were in Racine in 1870, and we will learn from the census of 1880 that they are in Racine. Is it possible they have moved in the interim? They have been in Racine less than 5 years. They were in Columbus 5 years. Less than 10 years after leaving England, are they going to relocate again? The answer is yes. Will they return to Columbus, where they had lived before? No. I can't find them there. But eventually I pick up a clue. Late in my search, I find in my father's papers a handwritten note. It came to my father via Lois Matson Welling, the daughter of Hazel Horner Matson. We will meet Hazel later, but here she has written family history in an abbreviated fashion. If we look closely, we see the notation that leads us to look at Cleveland, Ohio records. By the way, my father made those notes in the blue ink many years later. There in the Cleveland City directories, we find Richard listed. He and Harriet are apparently there early enough for Frank's birth in 1871, but got missed in the directory for their first couple years. Anyway, we are confident that the Richard A. Horner listed here is our Richard. In 1873, his occupation as file cutter is a unique enough designation to inspire our confidence. And if that is not sufficient, next year's edition lists 15-year-old Alfred as file cutter, 2 lines above his father. It begs the question, what is the reason for the relocation to yet again another totally new and different community? Well, a bubble of excessive railroad building and easy credit has burst. In the 1870s, the first Great Depression paralyzes the world economy. Unemployment rises to 14% in the U.S. There are few, if any, government safety nets. Here I speculate a bit. Rapidly industrializing Racine has been hit hard. But the news is that John D. Rockefeller's new business, called Standard Oil, is keeping Cleveland fairly stable, maybe even booming. Richard, nervous about prospects in Racine, gambles that the innovative oil business will generate opportunities for file cutters. The directory listings of 1874 through 1876 list Richard as a foreman, suggesting a promotion in some manufacturing enterprise. Teenager Alfred continues in his father's footsteps as a file cutter. Richard's gamble on Cleveland seems to have paid off. Brother John, meanwhile, continues his work in Racine, which must be successful, since before the decade is over, Richard and Harriet, teenage Alfred, with their toddlers Francis and Hattie, return to Racine. In 1880, they live next door to Brother John on 9th Street. I believe they have purchased these houses, and the brothers go into business together as file makers. Their shop is listed at 520 Villa Street. But life-changing events have taken place in John's life in the years Richard is in Cleveland. Back in Racine, tragedy awaits. John's wife, Mary, dies in 1874 at the age of 39, leaving her grieving husband and children Susanna, John Jr., and their son named Alfred. It is the same year Harriet, her sister, bears Hattie in far-off Ohio. But in the next couple years, John will meet a young woman who catches his eye, which causes us a detour that will set the stage for some of the ensuing events.